The humidity of the Atlanta afternoon hung heavy inside the Grace Fellowship Social Hall, thick with the scent of lukewarm potluck coffee and industrial-strength floor wax. Ruth stood at the head of the long, rectangular table, her hands clasped firmly over her floral print skirt. At 62, her posture was still that of the school principal she had been for 30 years. Shoulders back, chin level, eyes steady. But beneath the poise, her heart was a frantic bird batting against its cage. "I've asked for this moment," Ruth began, her voice carrying that melodic, authoritative lilt that usually silenced a rowdy cafeteria, "because I believe in the power of corporate prayer, and because I believe in a God of the 11th hour." Across the table, Sister Deborah, a woman whose hat was always 3 inches too tall and whose smile was 2 shades too sharp, leaned back, whispering something into the ear of the deacon's wife, Beverly. Ruth cleared her throat. "Starting tomorrow, at sunrise, I'm entering a 40-day fast. Water and broth only. I am petitioning the Lord for a covenant partner, a husband." The silence that followed wasn't holy, it was heavy. Then it broke. A sharp, jagged giggle escaped Sister Deborah's throat. It was infectious. Soon, the 2 women were leaning into each other, their shoulders shaking. Beverly didn't even bother to hide her smirk behind her napkin. "A husband, Ruth?" Deborah finally gasped, wiping a stray tear from her perfectly powdered cheek. "At 62? Honey, at our age, we're just praying the knees hold up long enough to get through the grocery store. You're asking for a wedding gown." "I'm asking for what was promised," Ruth said, her voice dropping an octave. The heat of a rage trigger began to simmer in her chest. She had spent 8 years as a widow, serving this church, cleaning the communion cups, and mentoring younger women who eventually moved on. She had been the reliable one, the strong one. "Well, the Bible does say Sarah conceived in her old age," Beverly added, her tone dripping with mock piety. "But Sarah had a husband already. You're asking God to manifest a man out of thin air? In this economy, most men your age are looking for a nurse, not a bride." "I don't need a patient," Ruth snapped, her dignity fraying at the edges. "And I don't need a paycheck. I'm looking for a man who loves the Word of God more than he loves himself. I have 40 days of breath left in the season of my life, and I'm giving them to God." The room went cold. The other women at the table, the ones too timid to laugh but too scared to defend, looked down at their empty plates. Ruth turned to leave, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. She made it all the way to the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary when a hand caught her elbow. It was Deborah. She wasn't laughing anymore. Her face had settled into a look of cold, hard honesty, the kind of look people use right before they try to kill a dream. "Ruth, stop this," Deborah whispered, loud enough for the stragglers in the hall to hear. "You're making a spectacle of yourself. Look in a mirror. The gray is in your hair, and the fire is out in your hearth. You've had your time. You're 62, darker than a winter night, and twice as tired." She stepped closer, her breath smelling of peppermint and malice. "Go home, Ruth. Drink your tea. Accept your widowhood. Because the truth is, God is a God of order. He does miracles for the young because they have a future. He doesn't do miracles for expired women." The door swung shut behind Deborah, the heavy thud echoing through the empty church like a gavel. Ruth stood alone in the shadows of the vestibule, the word expired ringing in her ears. She looked down at her hands, lined with years of work, but steady. 40 days, she whispered to the empty air, starting now. Day 1 of the fast felt like a physical weight. By 8 a.m., the hollow ache in Ruth's stomach wasn't just hunger, it was the echo of Sister Deborah's voice. Expired. The Grace Fellowship food pantry was a cramped, cinder block basement that smelled of dry pasta and damp cardboard. Ruth usually ran this place like a Swiss watch, but today her hands felt heavy. She reached for a crate of canned peaches on the top shelf, her breath hitching as the rickety wooden unit groaned and shifted. "Careful, Sister Ruth. That shelf has given up on its calling." The voice was low, gravelly, and carried a melodic lilt she didn't recognize. Ruth turned. Standing near the loading dock was a man who looked like he'd been pulled from the earth itself. He wore a faded, oversized canvas jacket stained with what looked like grease and Georgia red clay. His baseball cap was pulled low, shielding his face, and his boots were scuffed beyond repair. "I'm Junho," he said, stepping into the dim fluorescent light. He looked to be in his late 40s, his skin bronzed and lined at the corners of his eyes. "The pastor said you needed an extra pair of hands for the delivery." Ruth straightened her apron, her professional mask sliding into place. "Mr. Junho, thank you for coming. But that shelf isn't just tired. It's broken. I've been asking the deacons to fix it for 6 months. Junho didn't answer. He walked over to the unit, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look like a corporate man. He looked like a drifter who had seen too many miles. But when he looked up at Ruth, she froze. His eyes weren't scruffy. They were incredibly clear, deep, dark pools of stillness that seemed to look right past her tired face and into the prayer she had whispered that morning. 6 months is a long time to carry a burden alone, he said softly. He reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a small, professional-grade multi-tool. It looked expensive, the only thing about him that did. With a practiced flick of his wrist, he knelt by the base of the shelving unit. Ruth watched him. There was a strange dignity in the way he worked. He didn't complain about the dust or the cramped space. He moved with a quiet, meditative grace, his fingers sure and steady as he tightened the brackets and reinforced the frame. "You're not from around here," Ruth observed, trying to distract herself from the sudden, sharp pang of hunger. "I am a traveler," Junho replied, his voice vibrating against the concrete floor. "I am serving where I am told to stand." He stood up and gave the shelf a firm shove. It didn't budge. It was more solid than it had been in a decade. He then reached out, took the heavy crate of peaches from Ruth's hands, and slid it onto the shelf with effortless strength. "There," he said, wiping his hands on a rag, "support where there was weakness." He looked at her again, his gaze lingering on her pale lips. "You haven't eaten today, Sister Ruth." It wasn't a question. It was an observation that made her feel dangerously seen. "I'm fasting," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "For a miracle." Junho nodded slowly, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "A miracle isn't a magic trick, Ruth. It's a bridge built from one heart to another. Don't let the hunger make you bitter. Let it make you open." He turned back toward the crates, leaving Ruth standing in the middle of the pantry. For the first time since the mean girls had laughed at her, the word expire didn't feel so heavy. She watched him work. The scruffy stranger with the hands of a craftsman and the eyes of a king, and for a split second, the 40 days ahead didn't look like a desert. They looked like a path. By day 7, the spiritual high of the fast had been replaced by a grinding physical exhaustion. The pantry was freezing, the concrete floor leaching the warmth right out of Ruth's orthopedic shoes. Every time she stood up too quickly, the world tilted, a dizzying reminder that she was 62 and surviving on nothing but petition and water. The sound of a heavy diesel engine rumbling in the parking lot announced Junho's arrival. Ruth looked through the high, dirt-streaked basement window. His truck was a rusted midnight blue Ford F-150, the kind that groaned with every gear shift and looked like it had survived a dozen hailstorms. It was the chariot of a laborer, not a king. Junho entered the pantry carrying a small insulated thermos and a ceramic bowl. He looked as dusty as ever in a fleece jacket that had seen better decades, but his movements were fluid. precise. "The wind is turning north," he said, his voice a warm resonance in the chilly room. "Your strength is flagging, Ruth." "I am fine, Junho. The Lord is my strength," she replied, though her hand trembled as she reached for a bottle of water. "Even the prophets ate when the ravens brought meat," he countered gently. He set the bowl on the newly repaired shelf and opened the thermos. A savory, clean aroma filled the air. Garlic, ginger, and something deep and restorative. "It is ukajang broth. No solids. I strained it myself 3 times. It will not break your fast, but it will sustain your spirit." Ruth hesitated. "You shouldn't have gone to the trouble." "It is no trouble to honor a vow," he said. As she took the first sip, the warmth bloomed in her chest, steadying her pulse. Junho sat on a plastic crate across from her, his posture relaxed yet dignified. "Your English is perfect," Ruth noted, her educator's mind catching the nuance of his speech. "Better than perfect. You speak like someone who has studied the classics." Junho looked at his scarred knuckles, a flicker of something memory, grief, passing over his face. "I was educated to speak to power," he said quietly, "but I found that power has very little to say. I prefer the language of the humble now. It's more accurate." "The women in the ministry," Ruth began, her voice dropping. "They think I'm a fool. They think at 62, the story is over, that I'm praying for a ghost." Junho leaned forward. The fluorescent light caught the clarity of his eyes, and for a moment, the scruffy jacket seemed to vanish. He looked like a man who could command armies, yet he chose to sit in a basement with a hungry widow. "In my culture," he said, his voice dropping to a rhythmic, comforting cadence, "the older the tree, the deeper the roots. The deep roots are what hold the earth together when the storm comes. They aren't expired, Ruth. They are the foundation. You aren't praying for a ghost. You are praying for a cornerstone, and God does not mock a builder." He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from hers, close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from him. "I made a covenant once," he whispered. "I told him I would walk in the dust until I found a heart that glowed in the dark. I think the dust is finally settling." The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was charged, a first spark that felt less like a teenage crush and more like a tectonic shift. Ruth looked at this pantry worker and felt a terrifying, beautiful hope. Outside, the old Ford truck sat in the oil-stained lot, looking to all the world like a heap of junk. But inside the basement, the air tasted like a miracle in the making. Sister Helen was a woman who believed that godliness was next to expensive upholstery. As the pastor's wife, she navigated Grace Fellowship with the calculated grace of a shark in a silk Sunday suit. To Helen, the church basement was a place for those people, the broken, the hungry, and the dusty. On Tuesday afternoon, she was sitting in the sanctuary's bridal suite, scrolling through a digital edition of Global Finance Monthly. Her daughter, Chloe, sat nearby, huffing as she applied a 3rd layer of lip gloss. "Mama, why are we even here?" Chloe whined. "There isn't a single eligible man in this zip code under the age of 70. "Patience, Chloe," Helen murmured, her eyes scanning an article about the sudden disappearance of South Korea's golden CEO. "Positioning is everything. If you want a lion, you have to hang around the watering hole." She stopped scrolling. Her thumb froze on the glass screen. The headline read, "H. J. Kang, the Billionaire Missionary." Below it was a photograph from a gala in Seoul taken 3 years ago. The man in the tuxedo was lean, his hair swept back, his expression one of cold, aristocratic command. He was standing in front of a glass skyscraper that bore his family name. Helen squinted. She looked at the tuxedoed titan. Then she thought of the man she had seen unloading crates of cabbage at the loading dock that morning. The scruffy man in the stained canvas jacket. The one Ruth was always whispering with. "No," Helen breathed. her heart beginning to gallop. It can't be. She zoomed in on the eyes, those clear, deep, unmistakable eyes. Mama, you look like you just saw a ghost, Chloe said, leaning over. Not a ghost, Chloe, Helen whispered, her voice trembling with a sudden predatory fever. A gold mine. She showed the screen to her daughter. That man, the one driving the rusted Ford, the one helping Ruth with the canned goods. Chloe wrinkled her nose. The dusty man? What about him? That dusty man is Junho Kang, Helen hissed, her mind already spinning like a high-speed ledger. He owns half of the pharmaceutical patents in East Asia. He's not a drifter, Chloe. He's a king in hiding. He's doing some sort of spiritual pilgrimage, working in obscurity to find himself. Helen stood up, her silk skirts rustling like a warning. The greed hit her like a physical intoxicant, sweet and dizzying. She looked out the window toward the pantry entrance, where she saw Ruth and Junho laughing quietly over a stack of clipboards. A surge of pure spite rose in her throat. That old woman, Helen muttered. Ruth thinks she's fasting for a husband. She thinks she's found a simple man to grow old with. She turned to Chloe, her eyes narrowed into slits. But a man like that doesn't belong to a retired school principal. He belongs to a dynasty. He belongs to this family. What are we going to do? Chloe asked, her interest finally piqued. Helen smoothed her hair, her face hardening into a mask of false maternal concern. We are going to save him from a terrible mistake. Ruth is 62. She can't give him a legacy. She can't give him the life he's used to. She grabbed her designer handbag and headed for the door. Operation Mercy starts now, Chloe. We're going to the pantry, and you're going to start volunteering. The hunt had begun, and in Helen's mind, Ruth was no longer a sister in Christ. She was a squatter on a gold mine. The air in the food pantry, usually thick with the scent of cardboard and Junho's calming presence, suddenly curdled with the smell of expensive French perfume. The heavy basement door creaked open, and Sister Helen stepped inside, her heels clicking a rhythmic predatory staccato against the concrete. Behind her trailed Chloe, dressed in designer distressed leggings and a pristine white tank top that looked more suited for a Pilates studio than a dusty loading dock. Ruth, darling, Helen trilled, her voice echoing off the cinder blocks with a false, saccharine warmth. We've had a revelation. My Chloe has been feeling a burning conviction to serve the less fortunate. I told her, Chloe, honey, you go down there and help Sister Ruth. She's getting on in years, and this heavy lifting is simply too much for her brittle frame. Ruth, who had been labeling a shipment of oats, straightened her back. The brittle frame comment landed like a slap, but she kept her face neutral. Junho was in the corner, his back to them, stacking heavy crates of bottled water. That's very kind, Helen, Ruth said, her voice steady. But we have a system here. I'm doing just fine. Nonsense! Helen stepped forward, physically inserting herself between Ruth and the workspace. She nudged a stack of clipboards toward Chloe. Ruth, why don't you go over there and sweep the corners? You know how your eyes are. You're so much better at the little slow tasks. Chloe will handle the intake. She's young, her mind is quick with the digital logs. Chloe didn't look at Ruth. She was looking at Junho. Or rather, she was looking at the back of the man she now knew was worth 10 figures. Hi, Chloe said, her voice dropping into a rehearsed, breathy register as she walked toward Junho. I'm Chloe. I'm here to help you with the heavy stuff. Sister Ruth is a little overwhelmed today. Junho paused, a crate of water balanced easily against his chest. He turned slowly. His eyes flicked to Chloe, then to Helen, and finally settled on Ruth, who was standing by the brooms, her knuckles white. Overwhelmed? Junho asked. His voice was like low thunder. Ruth has been the engine of this house for 8 years. I have seen no signs of failure. Helen let out a tinkling, condescending laugh. Oh, you're so sweet to defend her, Mr. Junho. But let's be realistic. Ruth is 62. She's at the age where she should be sitting in a rocking chair, not dragging boxes around. It's almost cruel of us to let her continue. Helen then turned to Ruth, her smile vanishing into a look of feigned pity. Ruth, dear, be a sweetheart and go fetch us some cold waters from the back office. Chloe and Junho need to coordinate the new inventory. You're just in the way here, honey. The word servant wasn't spoken, but it hung in the air like smoke. Helen was treating the former school principal, the woman who had mentored half the congregation, like a dim-witted errand girl. Ruth felt the rage trigger pull tight in her chest. She looked at Junho. She expected him to see through it, to say something, but he remained silent, his expression unreadable as he set the crate down. Go ahead, Ruth, Helen urged, giving her a gentle, patronizing shove toward the back room. Rest those legs. We've got the youth covered now. Ruth turned away, the sting of humiliation hotter than the hunger in her stomach. As she walked toward the back, she heard Chloe's high-pitched giggle. So, Junho, my mom says you're a traveler. That is so mysterious. I've always wanted to see the world with someone who really understands it. Ruth leaned against the cold wall of the office, closing her eyes. She was on day 15 of her fast. Her body was weak, her heart was bruised, and for the first time, the mean girls weren't just laughing. They were moving in for the kill. By day 22, the world felt thin. Ruth's clothes were beginning to hang loosely on her frame, and her skin had taken on a translucent porcelain quality. The fast was doing its work. Her spirit was sensitive, vibrating like a tuned string. But her physical defenses were down. Helen chose this moment of vulnerability to strike. Ruth was in the quiet, dim hallway of the church basement, carrying a stack of empty egg cartons, when Helen intercepted her. There was no Chloe this time, no Junho. Just the two of them under the buzzing yellow hum of the fluorescent lights. Ruth, honey, Helen said, her voice dropping into that honey-thick tone she used for intervention prayers. She placed a hand on Ruth's arm, her grip surprisingly firm. We need to have a real talk, woman to woman, elder to, well, elder. Ruth didn't pull away, though every instinct told her to run. I have work to do, Helen. This is more important than inventory, Helen hissed, pulling Ruth into the small, cramped Sunday school supply closet. It smelled of construction paper and old glue. I've seen the way you look at that man, Junho, and I've seen the way he looks at you. Ruth felt a flicker of warmth, but Helen doused it instantly. It's cruel, Ruth. Truly. Cruel? Ruth's voice was a whisper. To find companionship? Companionship is for puppies, Ruth. A man like Junho. A man with his potential. Helen paused, careful not to reveal she knew about the billions. He needs a legacy. He is in the prime of his life. He needs a woman who can give him a household, children, a future that lasts longer than a few years before the nursing home calls. The word children hit Ruth like a physical blow to the stomach. At 62, that door hadn't just closed, it was bolted and rusted shut. You're being selfish, Helen continued, leaning in so close Ruth could see the jagged edges of her lip liner. You're clutching at him because you're lonely. But what are you giving him in return? A sunset? A man like that deserves a sunrise. He's kind, so he won't tell you. He'll let you waste his best years out of some misplaced sense of faith. But if you truly loved him, you'd step out of the way so he could find a woman who can actually build a life with him. Helen patted Ruth's cheek, a gesture that felt more like a brand. Don't let your prayer become his prison, Ruth. God wants us to be fruitful. Your season of fruit is over. Chloe, on the other hand, she has a lifetime of harvest left. Helen slipped out of the closet, leaving the door ajar. Ruth stood alone among the stacks of glitter and crayons. The hunger, which had been a dull ache, suddenly turned into a sharp, hollow void. She looked down at her hands. They were spotted with age, the skin thin as parchment. A man needs a legacy. For the first time in 22 days, Ruth didn't feel like a prayer warrior. She felt like a thief. She thought of Junho's strength, his vibrant spirit, and his mysterious covenant. Was she the answer to his prayer, or was she just a distraction he was too polite to cast aside? Her resolve, once as solid as the shelf Junho had repaired, began to crack. Day 37. The air in Atlanta was thick with a pre-storm humidity, but inside Ruth's body there was only a cold, hollow rattling. She had lost weight. Her collarbones were sharp ridges beneath her Sunday blouse, and her head felt disconnected from her shoulders, floating in a haze of lightheadedness and spiritual exhaustion. She was walking toward the pantry to finish the Friday logs when she saw them through the propped open side door. Junho was standing by his old Ford truck. Beside him, Chloe was doubled over, her hand resting familiarly on his forearm, her bright, youthful laughter ringing out across the asphalt. From Ruth's angle, it looked like a private, intimate world. Junho was smiling, a wide, genuine expression she hadn't seen all week. What Ruth couldn't see was Helen standing just inside the doorway, having just told a joke at Ruth's expense to force that polite social laugh from Junho. All Ruth saw was the legacy Helen had warned her about. The sunrise meeting, the sunrise. She looks like life, Ruth thought, a jagged pain blooming in her chest. And I look like the end. She turned away before they could see her. She didn't go to the pantry. She couldn't. Instead, she wandered into the main sanctuary. It was empty, the stained glass casting long, bloody streaks of crimson and violet across the pews. She sat in the third row, her legs trembling. In her purse was a Snickers bar she had bought weeks ago for a neighborhood child, a lump of chocolate and nougat that now felt like the only solid thing in a world of ghosts. Her fingers shook as she tore the wrapper. The crinkle of the plastic sounded like a thunderclap in the holy silence. "Lord," she whispered, a hot tear tracking through the powder on her cheek. "Did I hear you wrong? Was I just a lonely old woman dreaming of a girl's miracle?" She looked at the chocolate. Day 37, 3 days from the finish line. But what was the point of finishing a race if the prize had already been given to a younger runner? Helen's words played on a loop. "Your season of fruit is over." She lifted the bar to her lips. She wanted the sugar to drown out the bitterness. She wanted to stop feeling like a fool. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, the first sob racking her thin frame. "I'm so tired of being expired. I'm just tired." She closed her eyes, ready to bite, ready to surrender the fast and her dignity along with it. The chocolate touched her teeth. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary groaned open. A shaft of light cut through the gloom, hitting the altar. Ruth froze, the candy bar inches from her mouth, her face wet with salt and shame. The footsteps echoing against the marble aisle weren't the sharp, clicking heels of Sister Helen or the frantic scuff of Chloe's sneakers. They were heavy, rhythmic, and grounded. Ruth didn't look up. She sat huddled in the pew, the torn candy wrapper glinting like a silver sin in her hand. She felt small, shrunken by age, by hunger, and by the crushing weight of her own perceived insignificance. "The temple is a lonely place to eat a meal, Ruth." Junho's voice didn't carry the edge of judgment she expected. It was soft, like a hand placed gently on a fevered brow. He didn't stay at the end of the pew. He slid in beside her, leaving a respectful distance, his presence bringing the scent of rain and cedar into the stale air of the sanctuary. Ruth pulled the wrapper closed, her head bowed. "Go away, Junho. You should be outside with the life and the laughter. I am where I want to be, he said simply. He looked at the candy bar, then at the tears dripping off her chin. Day 37 is the hardest. It is when the body tries to scream louder than the soul. My soul is tired of screaming, Ruth whispered, finally looking at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Helen was right. I'm 62 years old, Junho. I'm fasting for a dream that belongs to a girl. I'm asking God for a covenant when I should be preparing for the end. Junho grew very still. He reached out not for her hand, but for the candy bar. He took it from her trembling fingers and set it on the wooden pew between them. When I lost my wife 12 years ago, he began, his voice dropping to a register of raw honesty that stopped Ruth's breath, I was the most powerful man in every room I entered. I had everything the world says a man needs for a legacy, but when she died, I realized my house was built on sand. I had no one who knew my soul, only people who knew my signature. He looked up at the giant wooden cross suspended above the altar. I made a covenant with God in the middle of my grief. I told him I would strip away the silk and the status. I told him I would walk in the dust and serve the broken until he showed me the woman who was the amen to my life's prayer. Ruth wiped her eyes, her heart fluttering. You were looking for someone? I wasn't looking for a daughter to raise or a trophy to display, Junho said, turning to face her. The scruffy jacket and the old truck seemed to fade away, leaving only the man. A man whose strength was seasoned, not raw. I was looking for a woman whose faith had been forged in the fire, a woman who knew that legacy isn't about bloodlines, but about whose name is written on the hearts we leave behind. He reached out then, his hand covering hers. His skin was warm, his grip steady. Helen sees a woman who is expired, Ruth. But when I look at you, I see a queen who has survived the desert. I see the only person who has looked at me and seen me, not what I can provide. I didn't come to this church for a mission. I came for a partner. He leaned in closer, his dark eyes burning with the conviction that made the candy bar on the seat look like a toy. Do not break your fast for a lie, Ruth. 3 more days. Finish the race, not for me, and not for the women laughing in the hall, but for the God who told you that you were right on time. Ruth looked at their joined hands, one aged and pale, one bronzed and scarred. The hollow ache in her stomach didn't vanish, but the hollow ache in her spirit did. 3 more days, she whispered. 3 more days, he promised, and then the world will see what I see. The Grace Fellowship banquet hall was transformed. White linens covered the folding tables and centerpieces of lilies. Helen's favorite perfumed the air with a cloying, sad sweetness. It was the 40th day. Ruth sat at a back table, her body feeling light, almost translucent. She had survived. Her fast ended at sundown, yet she felt no hunger, only a profound, vibrating stillness. She wore her best navy suit, the one she'd saved for special occasions that never seemed to come. Beside her, the seat she had saved for Junho remained empty. At the head table, Sister Helen was a vision of triumphant violet silk. She surveyed the room like a general who had already won the war. Chloe sat next to her, draped in a dress that was far too short for a church function, checking her reflection in a butter knife. Attention, everyone. If I could have your attention. Helen stood, tapping a crystal water glass with a silver spoon. The chime cut through the chatter of the congregation. Ruth looked toward the door. Still no Junho. A cold knot of dread began to tighten in her chest. Had he stayed away to spare her? Or had Helen finally found his price? Tonight is a night of celebration, Helen beamed, her eyes landing on Ruth with the precision of a predator. We are here to celebrate the fruit of our labors. But I also have a very special, very providential announcement. A murmur ran through the room. Deborah and Beverly leaned forward, their eyes gleaming with anticipated gossip. We have been blessed these past weeks by a humble servant in our midst, Mr. Junho, Helen continued, and as many of you know, my Chloe has been working side by side with him in our pantry. It has been such a joy to see two young, vibrant souls find a common mission. Helen paused for effect, her smile widening into something jagged. In light of certain discoveries about Junho's true stature and the future of this ministry, the pastor and I are thrilled to announce a special pairing. We are moving toward a union that will ensure the legacy of Grace Fellowship for generations to come. Chloe and Junho represent the future, the strength and the youth that our church needs to move forward. She looked directly at Ruth. It's so important to know when a season has ended and when a new one is beginning. We wouldn't want anyone clinging to outdated expectations. The room went deathly quiet. Heads turned. 100 pairs of eyes landed on Ruth, some with pity, most with the cruel satisfaction of seeing a delusional woman put in her place. Ruth, honey, Deborah whispered loud enough for the table to hear, I told you, God doesn't do miracles for the sunset years. He does them for the sunrise. Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. The humiliation was a physical heat, a roar in her ears. She looked at the empty chair beside her. The 40 days were over. The fast was done. And it seemed the mean girls were right. She was just a woman who had starved herself for a ghost. Chloe stood up, tossing her hair, a smug, practiced blush on her cheeks. I just want to say, Chloe began, that working with a man of Junho's assets has been eye-opening. The back doors of the hall swung open. The sound was like a crack of thunder. The congregation turned. It wasn't the scruffy man in the canvas jacket who walked through the threshold. It was a man the church didn't recognize, yet everyone instinctively rose for. He wore a charcoal gray suit that cost more than the church's mortgage. His hair was swept back, his posture was regal, and his face was set in stone. He didn't look at Helen. He didn't look at Chloe. His eyes were locked on the back table, on the woman in the navy suit who looked like she was about to break. The silence in the banquet hall was no longer heavy. It was suffocating. Junho walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing with the authority of a man who owned the ground he walked upon. The scruffy man was gone. In his place stood a titan of industry, radiating a cold, pressurized power that made the deacons instinctively straighten their ties. Helen's face transformed from triumphant to ecstatic. She practically fell over her chair to meet him. Junho, or should I say Mr. Kang, we were just telling everyone about the beautiful future you and Chloe. Junho didn't stop at the head table. He didn't even glance at Chloe, who had struck a pose like a debutante waiting for a crown. He walked straight past them, his eyes fixed on the back of the room until he stood beside Ruth. Gently, he placed a hand on Ruth's shoulder. The heat of his touch anchored her as she trembled. Sister Helen, Junho said. His voice wasn't the soft murmur of the food pantry. It was a resonant, commanding baritone that filled every corner of the hall. You speak of a special pairing. You speak of legacy and assets, but you have forgotten the only currency that matters in this house. He turned his gaze toward the head table, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. For weeks, I have walked among you in the dust, Junho continued. I wore the clothes of a laborer so I could see clearly. I wanted to know who would offer a cup of water to a stranger, and who would only offer a seat to a checkbook. Helen's smile flickered, then died. Now, Junho, let's not be dramatic. We were just celebrating your success. You were celebrating your greed, Junho interrupted, his voice like a gavel. You found out I'm the chairman of King Pharmaceuticals. You looked at my balance sheet and decided I was a prize for your daughter. You treated this sanctuary like a marketplace." He looked around at the congregation, his gaze lingering on Deborah and Beverly, who looked like they wanted to vanish into the floorboards. "You mocked this woman," he said, gesturing to Ruth. "You called her expired. You told her God doesn't do miracles for those in their sunset years. But I didn't come to Atlanta looking for a social climber who needs a lifestyle. I didn't come for youth that has no substance." He looked down at Ruth, his expression softening into something so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "I came for a prayer warrior," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate vibrato. "I came for a woman whose soul has the kind of beauty that doesn't wash off in the rain. I came for the only person who saw a man in a dusty jacket and offered him her respect, her heart, and her prayers before she knew he had a dime to his name." He turned back to Helen, his face hardening once more. "Your daughter is young, Helen, but she is hollow. Ruth is 62, and she is the richest person in this room. You tried to redirect what God ordained, but you forgot one thing. God doesn't answer to your timeline. He answers to the faithful." The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerators in the kitchen. Chloe sat down abruptly, her face a mask of humiliated rage. Helen looked like she had been struck. Junho offered his arm to Ruth. "The fast is over, Ruth, and I believe we have a much better table waiting for us." Ruth stood, her spirit soaring higher than it had in her entire life. She didn't look at the women who had mocked her with spite. She looked at them with a quiet, regal pity. She wasn't an expired widow anymore. She was a woman whose 40-day desert had just bloomed into a kingdom. The black car that picked them up from the church was a whisper on wheels, a sharp contrast to the rattling Ford truck that had served as Junho's disguise. As they drove away from the stunned silence of Grace Fellowship, Ruth sat in the plush leather seat, feeling like a dreamer who had forgotten how to wake up. "Where are we going, Junho?" she asked, her voice small. "The fast is over, but I feel like the world has shifted under my feet." "We are going to look at the blueprints of a promise," he replied. He took her to a quiet, high-end gallery space he had rented in downtown Atlanta. On the walls were not paintings, but architectural renderings, beautiful, modern structures of glass and stone, surrounded by the vibrant greenery of a tropical landscape. Junho led her to the center of the room, where a large bronze plaque sat on a velvet easel. Ruth leaned in, her breath catching as she read the engraved words, "The Clement Reed Memorial Clinic and Maternity Wing, Kumasi, Ghana." "Clement?" Ruth whispered, her hand trembling as she touched the name of her late husband. "You told me once, during the second week of your fast, that Clement's dream was to take his retirement savings and build a clinic in his father's village," Junho said, standing behind her. "You said he died with that dream still scribbled in a notebook in your bedside drawer." Ruth turned to him, tears blurring her vision. "How did you—" "I only mentioned that in passing. I thought it was a lost prayer." "Nothing is lost with God, Ruth, and nothing about your life is a footnote to me," Junho said firmly. He took her hands in his. "Helen and the others thought I was here to replace your past with my money. They thought a man like me would want you to forget where you came from. But I don't want to erase your history. I want to crown it." He pointed to the renderings. "Kang Pharmaceuticals is funding the entire project. It will be a state-of-the-art medical mission. It honors the man you loved for 30 years, and it creates the legacy that Helen claimed you couldn't have. You aren't just a widow, Ruth. You are the director of this foundation." Ruth looked back at the plaque. For years, she had felt like a keeper of graves, holding on to the memory of a husband long gone, fearing that any new happiness was a betrayal of the old. But Junho wasn't asking her to choose. He was building a bridge between her yesterday and their tomorrow. "You didn't just see me," Ruth realized, her voice thick with emotion. "You saw my whole life. You even saw him." "A covenant partner doesn't just love who you are today," Junho whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. He loves everything that made you the woman he prayed for. Clement planted the seeds, Ruth. I'm just the rain sent to help them finally bloom. In that moment, the final loophole of her heart closed. There was no guilt, no sense of being too old or finished. There was only a glorious global tapestry being woven by a God who remembered the notebooks of dead men and the fasts of aging women. 40 days, Ruth breathed, a laugh finally breaking through her tears. I asked for a husband. God gave me a kingdom. He gave us each other, Junho corrected gently, and we have a lot of work to do. The sanctuary of Grace Fellowship had never seen a day like this. The air was no longer stale with the scent of floor wax and judgment. It was alive with the fragrance of 10,000 white roses, imported and arranged with a precision that screamed of Junho's influence, yet felt as delicate as Ruth's spirit. In the vestibule, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension. Sister Deborah and Beverly stood in their usher uniforms, prim, stiff, and wearing expressions of forced humility that looked like ill-fitting shoes. They hadn't been invited to sit as guests. In a move of divine irony, Junho had requested the women's ministry leaders to serve as the door openers for the woman they had once called expired. I can't believe the thread count on these linens, Beverly whispered, adjusting her white gloves with a grimace. She's 62. Who wears a train that long at 62? A woman who has a billionaire holding the other end of it, Deborah hissed back, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She looked at the guest list, dignitaries, doctors from the Ghana mission, and executives from Seoul. The mean girls were no longer the social gatekeepers of the church. They were the help. The organ began to swell, a deep, resonant chord that shook the very floorboards. The heavy oak doors swung open. Ruth stood there, and the gossip in the pews died an instantaneous death. She wasn't wearing the sensible cream suit the congregation had expected. She was draped in a custom gown of silk and Korean lace, the color of moonlight. Her hair had been styled into an elegant, shimmering crown, and her skin, cleansed by the fast and fueled by joy, glowed with a radiance that no cosmetic could mimic. As she stepped forward, she didn't look like a woman at the end of her story. She looked like a woman on page 1. She passed Deborah and Beverly. She didn't glare. She didn't gloat. She simply gave them a serene, graceful nod, the look of a queen acknowledging her subjects. The two women instinctively bowed their heads, the weight of their own mockery finally crushing their pride. At the altar, Junho stood waiting. He wasn't the scruffy stranger anymore, nor was he the cold chairman. He was a man in a state of visible awe. As Ruth reached him, he took her hand, leaning in to whisper loud enough only for her to hear, "I told you, the dust has finally settled." The ceremony was a blur of sacred vows and a bridge of cultures, but the true moment of impact came afterward. Before the reception, Ruth stepped into the small bridal suite to adjust her veil. She stood alone before the full-length mirror. She looked at the lines around her eyes, each one a roadmap of the years she had spent waiting, grieving, and serving in the shadows. She looked at the strength in her shoulders. She remembered the candy bar in the pew. She remembered the sound of the laughter in the social hall. She remembered the hollow ache of day 37. She leaned in close to the glass, touching her reflection. She wasn't young by the world's definition, but she was something far more dangerous to the enemy of her soul. She was chosen. She was a testament that the clock of heaven doesn't run on human batteries. A knock came at the door. It was Junho, holding a glass of water and a single perfect piece of fruit, a symbolic end to a season of lack. "Are you ready, Mrs. King?" he asked, his eyes reflecting the light of 1,000 tomorrows. Ruth took his arm, her heels clicking firmly on the floor as she prepared to walk out into a life that exceeded her wildest petitions. She glanced back at the empty room where she had once wept in secret. The world had laughed. God hadn't. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak, and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 3. The end. If you loved this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more Christ-centered love stories of healing, hope, and love. And if you don't want to miss what God does in the next story, turn on notifications so you're always here when a new chapter drops. Until next time, keep believing in the grace of God that defies all odds.